Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about what is the likelihood of World War III. Okay, and when we're talking about World War III, we're talking about nuclear World War III. Okay, so this isn't the first time I'm hearing about this. I mean, I was in grammar school in the early 1980s, where this stuff would come up a lot in the news. So you would think that it's something that I kind of heard it before. What's different about this time around? But I definitely see some differences. Okay, so when we look at the current situation, right, the United States being the lone superpower, okay, or thinking it is the lone superpower, the important thing to, I think, understand approaching this is that the United States will do everything and anything to stay to stay number one, to be the lone superpower. Okay, it wants to be number one at all costs. Okay, now that includes being, even if you have a worldwide nuclear war where every country around the world is reduced, to 30% of what they were previously were. As long as the United States is number one of whatever is left over, I think they are totally okay with that. Okay, so I think that that's the mindset. When you look at the people running this country, Democrats and Republicans, the establishment, the deep state, the bureaucracies, I don't think that they would be willing to accept a world where the United States was not number one. Okay, so that's kind of like their number one priority. Okay, which basically to me is okay, they want to be the evil empire. Okay, back in the 1980s, I think Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and for good reason, because the Soviet doctrine, right, the communist doctrine is one of expansion. The communist doctrine is that, okay, communism, socialism cannot compete with a free world, with free market, a free market society. It cannot exist in society where people can say whatever they want, do whatever they want, not be dependent on government. Okay, so so Marxist philosophy, right, going all the way back to Karl Marx, is kind of dependent, right, on the whole world becoming Marxist. Okay, because if the entire world is not Marxist, people are going to basically not want to participate in that. They're going to want to go over to the other side. So in a Marxist world, in a socialist world, there is no room for competition. Okay, well, the tables have flipped here. Okay, the United States wants to be dominant. It wants everyone on the U.S. dollar. Okay, and they don't want anyone in the world to have an alternative. Okay, so when we look at the current situation right now, you've got Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and there's 30 other countries that are trying to get into BRICS, and I think Turkey just basically joined, or basically they're going to transition into BRICS, which is an alternative to the G7, which ultimately means that the world, okay, is moving away from doing business on the U.S. dollar. Okay, and this is basically this is an existential threat, right? I know a lot of times people use the word existential, very loosely, but the United States cannot function the way it functions now. Okay, it cannot continue to exist in its current form if if it doesn't have the U.S. dominant around the world, okay, the U.S. dollar dominant around the world, okay, that's what it's dependent on. That is its primary weapon. It's its primary control tool, okay, and BRICS is a real threat to that. And I think that the United States is not going to stand for that. I mean, they will do everything in their power to provoke war, okay, to break down this BRICS, okay? And I'm not saying that the BRICS nations aren't going to try and counter it or going to come up with ingenious ways to fight back against it. But the situation that I see here is that the United States will not accept a world in which it is not dominant, okay? And likewise, the rest of the world, the BRICS nations, right? You know, China, India, Russia, Turkey now, they are no longer willing to accept a world where the United States is dominant, okay? So these two sides are going to clash, and they're going to clash hard, okay? And like I said, the United States is not backing down from this. Now, the United States, the way I see it, has no choice, okay? If it wants to continue, to be the United States as it's become, it has to, it has to destroy BRICS. It has to destroy any alternative that's available to the rest of the world, right? In order to keep everyone on the U.S. dollar. So what we're going to do is let's take a step back here and look at the current situation with the U.S. dollar around the world. Okay, so right now our national debt is $35 trillion. We're going to talk about that. It's basically a number that just represents how much the U.S. dollar has been diluted around the world. Okay, we're going to go into some details. I want to kind of give you guys the headline first, the important stuff. Okay, so the total U.S. dollars around the world, right, in all the banks, right, total U.S. dollars, electronic money, right, that's around the world is 25 trillion. Now, I am rounding off here to the closest trillion, more or less. So 25 trillion, okay? The total debt in U.S. dollars around the world, so this is, like, let's say, banks, institutions that have lent out money in U.S. dollars in banks around the world, okay, is 75 trillion, okay? So there's a total of $25 trillion in total U.S. dollars around the world to pay a total of $75 trillion in debt, okay? So obviously there's a lot more debt than U.S. dollars exist to pay that debt. So right away there's an issue there, okay? So by itself, this isn't that much of an issue. What is an issue is, of the $75 trillion total debt, the United States is 35 trillion of that. Okay, and again, this is representative of how much they have diluted the money. So the world is looking at this and they're seeing, because of these ratios here, that the United States is obviously printing money. So the United States has no productivity, right? We don't produce anything, okay, in large volume. Okay? So when we look at like the world's ship production, China produces 50% of the world's ships right now. Okay, the United States produces like 0.13% of the world's ships. So for like every 1,000 ships that China produces by tonnage, the United States produces just 10 ships. Okay, so the United States has no production. Okay, now this also means that the United States has no war capacity either, okay, other than the nuclear weapons, okay, because here's the thing: if you have a war, machines get destroyed, they have to be replaced. And the reason why the United States was somewhat successful in World War II, okay, is because they were able to outproduce Japan and Germany, okay. But now through two means, right? Number one, they had the factories, they had production here in the United States. And number two, the factories in those other places in the world were being destroyed. Okay, so the United States, had production, right? And it had the ability to produce war machines, which gave it a huge war capability. So when we look at China producing 50% of the world ships, and you might say, hey, those are cargo ships, but those can easily, that production can easily be transitioned into war productivity, right? They can stop producing cargo ships, or they can convert those cargo ships into warships the same way the United States did during World War II, right? They turned their civilian industrial capacity into war capacity, okay? So it took the United States, what, like a year, 2 years to make that transition? So China has that same ability. It's a lot easier for China to go from, 1,000 cargo ships a year to 1,000, warships per year than it is, let's say, for the United States to go from 10 ships a year to go to 20 ships a year, or 30, or it's a lot harder for the United States to increase its productivity of war material, okay? So the United States has no production. It has no war machine producing capability, okay? Basically, it has the army that it has, and that's what it's stuck with, okay? Which is heavily dependent on air power, GPS, satellites, which, are things that can be targeted. And again, if you don't have the productivity, you don't have the production, it's hard to replace those things. So if the United States doesn't have, like civilian production, they don't have war production, right? War machines. What does the United States have? Well, they have the ability to print money, okay? So that is the number one thing that the United States has had. They've been able to get the entire world on the US dollar. So what that means is they can tax the world, right? Because every time the United States electronically prints money, what they're doing is they're diluting the value of the existing money, okay? And what that means is that because anytime the government reduces the buying power of your money, they're taxing you, okay? So when the United States reduces the buying power of money around the world through money dilution, they are taxing the world, okay? And that is like one of the key elements that have made the United States a superpower, their ability to tax the world, okay? To the tune of $35 trillion, because that represents how much money has been electronically printed. And that is like 46% of the total debt out there in the world, okay? So the world has caught on that the United States is printing money. And this is not, the United States really doesn't have debt, right? Because basically who is this debt to? They owe themselves money. So this debt will never get paid back. Every 100 days now with interest, $1 trillion is being added to this national debt. So again, it is a meaningless number. The only thing that's happening here is the world has become aware that the United States is printing money electronically, thus taxing them. And the world has decided that they don't want to be taxed anymore. So hence you got this BRICS alliance where the world is now, making efforts to move away from the US dollar. So this is an existential threat to the United States because, again, they got no production. They don't have the ability to really mass produce war machines anymore, right? Other than the nuclear missiles that they already have, okay? And the only weapon that they have other than the nuclear missiles is the dollar that the whole world is dependent on. And the world is saying, we don't want your dollar anymore. So what happens if the world abandons the US dollar, right? Let's say they start doing business in other currencies. The US dollar is going to start losing value around the world. That money is going to start flooding back into the United States. So we're going to have extreme inflation here in the United States. We're looking at the collapse of, the United States economically, okay, which is going to mean a total collapse. So when you look at this scenario, what option, like logically speaking, right, what option does the United States have, okay? Do they want to go back to not being a superpower, right? Are Democrats willing to accept that? Are Republicans willing to accept that? I don't think so, okay? I think that they will do everything, including provoke World War III to basically to stay number one, to stay the sole remaining nuclear power. Now, this is a threat to every country, because if you have a situation where the United States and Russia, let's say, go to war, right, and they start launching nuclear weapons at each other, and remember, I mean, it doesn't matter, because a lot of times people question, well, how many nuclear weapons does Russia have? I mean, they don't need to land 1,000. They just need to land 20 or 30 of them here, okay? That would basically completely destabilize the United States. So, 20 or 30 going either way and successfully hitting their targets is enough, okay? So, obviously they're going to target, really important places that would cause collapses in society. So, the generals, the Republicans, Democrats, looking at this strategically, they're like, okay, fine. If United States and Russia, let's say, reduce each other to 30% of what they were before, right? Well, what's going to happen? Basically, what about the rest of the countries in the world, right? Because they can't have a situation where the United States is, let's say, reduced to 30%, but let's say China remains as is. India remains as is. Brazil remains as is. Italy, Greece, Turkey remain as is. So what the generals strategically are, I think, thinking is that if the United States is going to be reduced to 30% of what it is now, every other major country in the world also must be reduced by the same percentage, regardless of whether or not they have anything to do with this or instigated or playing any role. It's just a matter of staying number one, okay? That's what this is all about, staying number one at all costs, okay? So something for you guys to think about. Let me pause for a second. But this is the main thing of this video, okay? I want you guys to think about this. Take a minute, think about this. All right, so now let's talk about this Ukraine situation. Because I don't think this war in Ukraine really has, anything to do with Ukraine independence, or, the sole purpose of this war in Ukraine, I believe, was to basically try to break up BRICS, right? Because they had China and Russia, it seemed like they were getting cozy, and India getting cozy with each other, and the United States was not comfortable with this, and they're like thinking, hey, let's get Russia, let's try and bankrupt Russia, okay? So the idea there was that they were going to get Ukraine to start up this war, and hopefully destabilize Russia, okay? Now, the opposite has happened, and I've covered this in another video, because because in Russia, the way I've come to understand it, you had a lot of oligarchs that were kind of left over from the 90s that had a lot of power, because they kind of had a monopoly. They were doing business with the West. And what happened was these sanctions that were imposed on Russia, what it really did is it took a lot of power away from these oligarchs, and it made the Russian government, it gave essentially more power to the Russian government. Okay, so it kind of gave them a chance to make their country stronger by getting rid of a lot of these oligarchs. Now, the other thing that it did, okay, is that much of the world is looking at this situation, and they're thinking to themselves, because basically the United States imposed these sanctions on Russia, okay? Again, trying to bankrupt them, okay? And the world is like, much of the world is like, okay, let's sit back and see what happens with this. So what they're seeing is that these sanctions did not have much of an effect on Russia. In fact, Russia's doing a lot better post-sanctions, because now what they did is, instead of doing business with Europe, they're doing business with China, okay? They're exporting a lot of their oil to China at higher prices, because the price of oil has gone up as a result of these sanctions. So Russia's actually selling their oil at a higher price, okay? And the other thing that's happened is that the Europeans that need oil are still buying Russian oil. It's just that it's basically going through a middleman, okay? It's being basically pumped somewhere in the Mediterranean. It's being pumped from Russian ships into some other ship, into Turkish ships, because the Turks are obviously working with the Russians now, and then the Turks are selling it to Europe at a higher price. So again, Russia is profiting from that. So you've got all these countries around the world that are seeing that Russia doesn't need to do business with Europe, doesn't need to do business with the United States. The sanctions aren't hurting it, right? They're actually prospering. And now you've got more and more nations that are saying, hey, screw the G7, we're going BRICS, okay? And you know, and a lot of countries are trying to get into BRICS. And the idea with BRICS is they're making private agreements not to do business transactions in US dollars, okay? And I think Saudi Arabia is one of those countries that has agreed not to do business, let's say, with China in US dollars. They're using their own currencies. So they're not, because it would have been a lot more difficult if they were trying to come up with an alternative currency. But instead, they're doing the smart thing. The easier thing was they're saying, hey, we're not going to do business in US dollars. We're going to do business in our own currency. So let's work this out amongst ourselves. So it's a lot easier, let's say, for China and Saudi Arabia to make a deal between themselves of how they're going to make the transactions, how they're going to, you know, what kind of business they're going to do. You know, it's a lot easier for, let's say, you know, India and Russia to basically do the, make their own deals. So all this BRICS agreement is right now is these countries are agreeing to do business amongst themselves in their own currency, not using US dollars. So this is like an immediate thing, okay? This isn't like some long-term plan that has to go into effect. This is immediately hurting the the United States and the US dollar, okay? So when you come back to this and you say, and you see that, hey, the United States doesn't have production, doesn't have war-producing capability, no longer has dollars, the United States is now in a very desperate position, right? And what happens when you corner an animal? It becomes very aggressive and attacks. And I think that is the situation where the United States is in. And they really don't have, because here's the thing, yeah, they got all these aircraft carriers. The aircraft carriers are really useful for attacking small countries. They're not all that useful for attacking, let's say, China, India, you know, Russia, Pakistan, because those are like pretty far inland. So the aircraft carriers really aren't that effective. So what do they have to attack them with or fight them with? But, you know, they can't move conventional armies that far in, right? Because they're going to end up like, you know, like Nazi Germany trying to go cross land. They can't do it that way. So what's the only alternative they have? Ballistic missiles. That's the only way that they can fight them. So going back to the original question, how close are we to World War III? I think pretty damn close. And the reason is because I don't think the United States has an alternative. Okay, it is committed to being #1 superpower. Absolutely committed to being that at all costs. Okay, so how is it going to do that? Okay, the world doesn't want its US dollars anymore. The United States doesn't have anything to sell. Okay. The only means that it has available to it is nuclear war. Okay. And like I said earlier, it doesn't, you know, they've already accepted that, hey, you've got a worldwide nuclear war. The United States is going to be reduced to, let's say, 30 or maybe even 20% of its capacity. Well, they're okay with that as long as my opinion anyway, I believe that they are okay with it as long as the rest of the world is also reduced to 20% of their capacity, right? So the United States is still #1 of the remaining pile of rubble that's left over, okay? So the situation in Ukraine, I think that's like they thought that they could destroy Russia, okay, and break up BRICS. It's not working, okay? From everything I hear, and I'm hearing stuff from both sides. I hear people saying Russia's winning. I hear people say Ukraine's winning. But here's what I also hear. I hear the Ukrainians themselves are reporting that they are very low on manpower, okay? So NATO, United States sending over machines, war machines that nobody can operate is not very useful, okay? So they have a manpower capability, and the nature of the idea with the United States had is that they were going to move warfare to a highly technical level that they thought that only the type of warfare that they thought only the United States could do, right? Because it takes a long time to train people on fighter jets and computerized tanks and stuff like that. So now this is actually working against them, because you got now even if you recruit additional people in Ukraine, right? It takes too long to train them on this highly technical equipment, okay? So the technology is actually working against them. And it's also very expensive, because what's happening is the Russians are sending over $500 drones. The United States is trying to shoot them down with $1 million missiles. So, economically, you're going to run out of $1 million missiles before you run out of $500 drones, right? So they've already run out of the missiles, and the drones keep coming, okay? So they're losing on that end. Now, as far as manpower, from what I'm hearing is the Russians, aside from using their own population, right, are also hiring mercenaries from China, India, Pakistan. So they've got like a couple of billion people over there to also hire to fight for them, okay? The Ukrainians don't have that capability. They would have to go to Europe, and the Europeans, they might be willing to vocally support them. I don't think that they're actually willing to go and die for them, okay, or die for the United States. So it's a lot easier for the Russians to hire Chinese, Indians, Pakistanis, to go out into the front lines. So manpower-wise, Russia definitely has the advantage there, okay? So it's obviously, if they can't win manpower-wise, how's the United States going to win this war, right, and stay number one? By default, it has to go nuclear. It has to. There's no other way they can stay number one. And like normally you would say, why would, who wants to live in the world like that? You gotta understand that the generals and, the U.S. War industry, Republicans, Democrats, at the high levels, they think very differently, right? Because their families are going to get to the bunkers when they need to get to the bunkers, right? So that's a price that they are willing to pay, okay? So there's something for you guys to think about, okay? So let's take a short pause on that and think about it. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about the monetary system, how it works. I've covered this on other videos, but I want to cover this again. How it works, how we kind of got ourselves into a situation, what are the possibilities. And again, the possibilities I see is one option, but let's look at it. So the way our monetary system works is we have what we call, it's supposed to be an asset-based system, okay? So when you go to get a mortgage on your house or you finance a car, okay, the bank takes the deed to your house or the title to your car, okay, and they create money, okay, locally, like your local bank is able to do that. So this is no different than if you have a gold mine. You mine gold, you bring the gold to the bank, and the bank creates money off of that gold, okay? So most people don't have access to gold mines, right? So instead of using gold, we use other assets to create money. So that system would work fine on its own, as an asset-based system, if the government had not corrupted it by creating money without assets. So when the government wants to create money, they don't put up collateral, right? What they do is they basically give themselves an IOU, right? So they create money, and then they raise this debt number, to kind of balance their balance sheet, to make it seem like there's actually something happening here besides just creating money nilly-willy. But that's really what they do, okay? That's really what they do, because the government can create any amount of money it wants because it's not limited by collateral. Me and you, we're limited as to how much money we can create because we have to put up real collateral, okay? Where if we don't pay it, they take away our asset, right? We lose ownership, the bank takes it. When the United States creates money, they don't have to do that. They're only limited by what they call the debt ceiling, and they basically vote to increase it every time they want to increase it. Okay, so a lot of times people say, well, if we were on a gold-based system, this wouldn't be an issue. Yeah, it would be an issue, right? Because again, okay, so first of all, if it was a gold-based system, we couldn't create money, okay? The only people creating the money here would be the government that has the gold, okay? Or the gold companies that have the gold, okay? We couldn't create money. It's completely centralizing the money creation, because right now it's half of it is decentralized in the sense that all of us can create money locally. If the government is creating money, then it's completely centralized. They're the only ones that are putting up money. Now, with a gold-based system, right, number one, like if we look back in the 30s, the United States, when they confiscated gold, right, they were setting the price of gold, and it wasn't really a gold-based system. All they wanted to do was get the gold out of the system so that it wasn't competing against their US dollars, right? So we were never really on a gold-based system. They never used the gold to really create money, but they wanted to get the gold out of circulation so that everybody was on their US dollars, okay? So, but even if you were to try and create a gold-based system, they have the gold, they have access to mining more gold, and the earth is full of gold, okay? The deeper you mine, the more gold you will get, right? When the earth was formed, the heavier metals formed, basically settled more towards the center. So, maybe 200 years ago, you could find gold, let's say, out, on the surface in certain places, right? But all that's been collected off of the surface and off the mines that are near the surface. So now to get gold, you got to mine deeper and deeper and deeper into the earth. And what they do is they do quarry mining, right? They just mine out an entire area and then they sort it out, okay? But so you need, like, only large companies that have huge capacity are able to do this, right? So we can't do it. So so we have no ability to create gold. So number one, the government has the gold. Number two, they have the ability to set the price of gold. They can take gold away from you whenever they want. And then you get into issues that, like, they can, what's the ratio going to be, right? Because keep in mind that, like, there's supposed to be gold in the Federal Reserve banks, but they won't it hasn't been audited, I think, since like the 50s or the 60s, okay? So having a gold-based system that you can't even audit, or don't know what they have, you can't participate in the price creation. They can vote, right? The Congress, the Republicans and Democrats can vote to change the ratios to whatever they want, okay? It doesn't change the system, okay? It's the same thing, basically. It's just, it would just have a different label on top of it, okay? So the point there is that you can't fix this system just by tweaking it a little bit and saying that, okay, it's not going to be gold-based instead of mortgage-based, because they're willing to cheat it, okay? So if they're willing to cheat it, you're not going to fix it by tweaking it, legally speaking, right? So I went completely off. Hold on for a second. Okay, back on track now. Okay, so we create money by putting up assets. The government creates money out of thin air. They don't put up assets. They just increase this balance sheet number here called, national debt. It's never going to get paid back. And this number is so big. I tell people a million seconds is a week. A billion seconds is 31 years. A trillion seconds is 31,000 years. Okay, so the number trillion is a tremendous number. There's nobody that the United States could actually borrow $1 trillion from, except, basically they just create it electronically on the computer, diluting the existing, diluting the existing money. Okay, so the United States, looking at this situation, is perfectly comfortable with the situation, right? Because they're like, okay, anytime we need money, we're just going to print it up, dilute the existing money. And as long as everybody around the world is on our dollars, it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't matter if that's 35 trillion, the national debt goes up to 100 trillion, national debt goes up to a gazillion, right? It doesn't make a difference, right, what the national debt number is, because essentially the United States, through this national debt, is just able to create money to pay whatever it wants, okay? And this actually empowers the government, because the way, if we go back to this situation here, there's $25 trillion in the whole world right now, right? But the total world debt is $75 trillion. So the way this system works, it's set up as a Ponzi scheme, okay? So let's go back to the mortgage analysis. So if I, let's say, take a mortgage on the house, okay, let's say the house is worth $200,000. I put up the mortgage, the bank gives me $200,000, but I have to pay back the bank $300,000 with interest, okay? So the bank originally only creates the principal amount, right? They give me $200,000, that's the only thing that they create. How am I going to pay back $300,000 if they haven't created it? Because this is happening across the board. In this example, let's say everybody this year, gets a mortgage for $200,000. Everybody needs to pay back $300,000. How is everybody going to do that? Well, this generation is dependent on the next generation next year to come in and create more money so we can do business with those people, so I can get that additional $100,000 to pay back my principal plus interest, okay? So it's a Ponzi scheme that, it depends on more and more people coming into the system in order to, so I can pay back my principal plus interest, okay? And it has to be people of the same size, right? Because if I've got, let's say I have a $200,000 mortgage on my house, it does me no good. It's not useful for me if everybody else coming in after me is only getting, let's say, a mortgage for, I don't know, $1,000, right? Because there's not going to be enough money creation for my generation, right? So the next generation has to come in at the same level so that the system can keep going. So in this situation here where the U.S. government is 46%, right, 35 trillion of the total debt in the world, which is 75 trillion, right? There's nobody big enough, there's nobody of the size of the United States government to come in and create more money, okay? So that's the problem with the system. So the system right now is dependent on one source, okay? Since nobody of the size of the United States can come in and create more money, only the United States government can continue to create money so that the rest of the world, right, can pay the 75 trillion. So if the total debt in the world is 75 trillion, all right, and let's say the national debt right now is, the total number of cash in the world is 25 trillion, right? Much of this 75 trillion debt is maturing next year, right? So of the 75 trillion, let's say 10 trillion of that has to be paid next year. Well, the United States government has to increase the total money supply by another $10 trillion in order to cover the 10 trillion that is maturing next year, okay? So right now, the system is dependent on the United States government continually creating more money so people don't default, because that's what's going to happen. If the government doesn't create more money, right, the debtors are going to default because there's nobody coming in to create more money. Okay, so the United States likes this, right? Because now the world is dependent on the United States to create more money. So that's a control, that has turned into a control feature, because now it's like, okay, so I'm the sole creator of money. If you want my money, or if you want us to create money and give it to you, these are the things that you need to do, okay? So now they're in the position to dictate, we're going to give money to this business, we're going to give money to that industry, we're going to give money to that industry, we're not going to give any money to that industry, we're not going to give any money to that industry. They're essentially making the entire world dependent on the United States government because they're the sole creators of new money that everyone is dependent on, okay? So the rest of the world sees this, right? They see that, hey, the United States is the only one that can make money. We're dependent on the United States government. If we want them to give us money, okay, we have to do what they tell us. We don't want to do that anymore. Okay, so let's look at the consequences, because all the purpose of all that now is really to get to this point of all that information I gave you. So where we are right now, okay, the rest of the world has the ability to say, you know what, we're going to default. Okay, we don't want your money. Okay, because here in the United States, if I don't pay my mortgage, right, what's going to happen? The government's the bank is going to take my property. It's going to take my house, okay? And they have marshals, they have law enforcement working for them. They can do that, right? But if you're someplace else in the world and let's say you default on your loan, you're not paying back what you owe, right? What's the United States going to do, right? They can't do anything other than send in the military. Now, not so easy to do. It might be easy to do if it's a small country near the shore, right, where they can send their aircraft carriers. But if you're in the middle of Europe, if you're in the middle of Asia, not so easy to go there and take your property, okay? So this is a real threat from the perspective of the United States, because if the rest of the world decides that they're going to start defaulting on this debt for the reason that, hey, the United States, you can't do anything. You can't take, we're not going to pay you. You can't do anything about that, right? And the rate of defaults, right, once one nation or one group of companies starts doing it, other companies are going to catch on and like, hey, we don't have to pay our debts. And then the United States, the dollar is going to start like crashing at a faster and faster and faster rate. So going back to the original subject of this video, the United States is kind of like, it's a do or die situation, okay? Everybody has to be on the US dollar. Anybody trying to get off the US dollar has to be like destroyed, okay? And that's why it's like, I think we are definitely headed for nuclear war, okay? And again, this isn't like, I grew up with this in the 80s, so it's not something that I scare easy. Like back then, it was simply a matter of, you had two sides and they were like somewhat equal. Well, actually what happened, I think, like Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Post World War II, the United States has the nuclear bomb, right? They dropped it on Japan, demonstrating to the Russians that, hey, we got a bomb. Right? And at that point, they were essentially the sole nuclear power, okay? And then the Russians got it, okay? And what the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, what it ultimately became was the United States agreeing that, hey, you know what? We're going to share power with the Soviet Union, okay? The Soviet Union can have your side of the world. We're going to have our side of the world. We're not going to try and, or vice versa. Maybe it was the Soviet Union trying to expand. But the point is that you had two sides that agreed that they were going to share power. Okay, that's what it was. Okay, and then in the 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and now you have this Russian Federation that was very weak. Okay, so the United States liked that, and they really want Russia to go back to being the Russia of the 90s. They want it to be weak. They don't want it to be strong again. They don't want to have competition. But what's different this time around is a much bigger percentage of the world is dependent on the US dollar. And if the world gets off the US dollar, the United States is not going to be the superpower. Okay, the superpower is going to be the BRICS nations in combination. And the United States is like, no, we're not going to be number 2 or 3 or 4, right? So I really see the situation as a do or die type of situation for the United States. They're not willing to accept not being number 1. So that's why I think that like World War III, nuclear World War III is like almost certain. Okay? So some things for you guys to think about. I mean, these are my opinions. If you see it differently, and I hope you do. I hope you can convince me in the comments that I'm wrong. Okay, please do so. Convince me that I'm wrong, and I will definitely feel a lot better. Okay, but this is how I see the situation. The United States only has one. It's basically standing on one leg right now, and that's its U.S. dollar being its number 1 asset. And the world is saying, we don't, we're not going to let you control us with the U.S. dollar anymore. And I don't think the United States is going to accept that. So anyway, talk to you all soon.